You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The dream started recurring 3 weeks before I knew my great-aunt Cordelia was dead. Every night the same vision, an ancient cemetery stretching impossibly far in all directions, with a small cottage where someone who looked exactly like me tended graves that rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking. In the dream, I could hear a woman's voice calling my name from somewhere among the headstones, but I never answered, and I never understood why. The dreams weren't ordinary nighttime visions. They possessed a weight and texture that felt more real than my waking hours. I would find myself standing in morning light that had never touched earth, breathing air that tasted of possibilities and regrets. The cemetery existed in perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but something between that had no name in any language I knew. Each dream revealed new details. The headstones bore inscriptions in scripts that shifted when I tried to read them, forming words in languages that felt familiar despite being impossible. Some graves were freshly dug, their soil still dark and rich, while others had weathered for centuries beyond counting. The paths between them followed geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate directly, forming spirals and helixes that folded space around themselves. The cottage stood at the centre of it all, built from stones that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Smoke rose from its chimney in spirals that defied wind and gravity, forming symbols in the air before dissipating into nothingness. Windows glowed with warm, yellow light, but when I tried to approach, the building would retreat, maintaining its distance no matter how far I walked. And always, the voice calling my name. Sometimes it sounded like my mother, dead now for 5 years. Other times, it carried the tone of lovers I'd lost, friends who'd drifted away, family members I'd never properly mourned. The voice promised answers to questions I'd never learned how to ask, offered closure for wounds that had never healed. But the figure who looked like me never responded. He would continue his work, trimming grass that grew in fractal patterns, repairing monuments that rebuilt themselves while he worked, maintaining paths that led to destinations that changed based on who might walk them. His movements followed a rhythm that seemed choreographed by forces beyond human understanding. On the night the dream stopped, I woke to find my phone ringing at 3:17 a.m. The silence in my Chicago apartment felt different, as if something fundamental had shifted in the world while I slept. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer I'd never met, informing me that my great-aunt Cordelia had passed away and named me as her sole inheritor. Not of money or property, but of a position I'd never heard of at a church I'd never visited. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer said, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested he understood more about the situation than he was willing to reveal. Miss Cordelia left very specific instructions about the transfer of responsibilities. She was quite insistent that you would understand the importance of maintaining continuity. I barely remembered Cordelia from childhood visits, a stern woman with silver hair who always smelled of lavender and spoke in hushed tones about her work. My parents had taken me to see her perhaps half a dozen times, always during daylight hours, always departing before sunset. She lived in a place called Milbrook, in a cottage behind a church where she tended graves and maintained grounds. What I did remember was the way she would sometimes stop mid-sentence and listen to sounds only she could hear, tilting her head as if deciphering messages carried on frequencies beyond normal perception. She would nod occasionally, as if acknowledging conversations that existed only in her mind, and she'd once told me during my last visit at age 12 that some jobs choose their people rather than the other way around. "You have the sight," she had said, studying my face with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Not fully developed yet, but it's there. The ability to perceive what others cannot, to understand connections that most minds reject as impossible. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." I'd been living in Chicago for 8 years, working a dead-end office job that barely paid my bills. Data entry for an insurance company, processing claims that dealt with the mundane tragedies of normal life. Car accidents, house fires, medical emergencies, events that followed logical patterns of cause and effect that could be categorized and filed and forgotten. The inheritance seemed like divine intervention, a chance to escape the grinding routine of city life and find something meaningful. The lawyer who contacted me mentioned a modest salary and free housing, which sounded like paradise compared to my cramped studio apartment where the neighbours screamed at each other through paper-thin walls and the radiator clanged with mechanical desperation. But there was something in the lawyer's voice that suggested this wasn't a simple job offer. He spoke about responsibilities and continuity and the importance of understanding certain traditions. He mentioned that the position came with specific requirements that would be explained in documentation left by my great-aunt. "There are things about this work that can't be discussed over the phone," he said. "Miss Cordelia was very clear about that. She said you would need to experience it directly to understand, but she also wanted me to tell you that once you accept the position, leaving becomes complicated." I asked what he meant by complicated, but he had already moved on to discussing practical matters. Travel arrangements, keys, the transfer of legal documents. The conversation ended with an address and a reminder that I was expected within the week. The drive to Milbrook took 3 hours through winding country roads that seemed to lead steadily backward through decades. The further I travelled from the city, the more the landscape changed in ways that felt fundamentally wrong. Modern gas stations gave way to family-owned stores with hand-painted signs that looked fresh, despite advertising prices from 20 years ago. Cell phone towers disappeared, but the radio never lost signal, playing songs I'd never heard that sounded like they were being performed live, somewhere just out of sight. The music had a quality that made my skin crawl, melodies that seemed to bend time around themselves, harmonies that suggested the existence of instruments that had never been invented. Mile markers appeared in sequences that defied mathematical logic. I would pass marker 47, then 52, then 31, as if distance itself followed different rules here. The sun moved across the sky in stuttering jumps, sometimes hanging motionless for what felt like hours, other times racing toward the horizon with supernatural speed. The landscape grew increasingly strange as I drove deeper into whatever this place was. Trees lined the road in formations that created optical illusions, their trunks forming patterns that seemed to spell out words in a script I couldn't identify. Fields stretched impossibly far in all directions, filled with crops that had never existed, plants that grew in helical spirals reaching toward a sky that was the wrong shade of blue. I passed farmhouses that looked simultaneously ancient and newly built, their architecture following design principles that human minds shouldn't have been able to conceive. Barns with doors that opened onto starlit voids. Silos that extended far higher into the sky than physics should have allowed. Gardens where flowers bloomed in colours that had no names, their petals forming geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The few people I saw moved with a deliberate slowness that suggested they experienced time differently than I did. A farmer working his field would raise his hand in greeting, and the gesture would take several seconds to complete as if he were moving through water rather than air. Children playing in a schoolyard would freeze mid-motion when they noticed my car, turning to watch with expressions of infinite patience. The town itself seemed frozen in time, but not in the quaint way tourist brochures described. This was a place where time moved differently, where cause and effect followed older rules that predated human understanding. Main Street stretched for only 6 blocks, lined with businesses that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s, but the people walking between them wore clothes from different decades without seeming to notice. A woman in a 1940s dress chatted with a man in modern jeans, while children in Victorian-era clothing played hopscotch on sidewalks that had been poured yesterday. Their conversation carried across the distance with perfect clarity, though they spoke about events that hadn't happened yet, using references to technologies that didn't exist. The barbershop had a rotating pole that spun in impossible directions, sometimes clockwise, sometimes counterclockwise, occasionally moving through dimensions that had no names. The general store's windows displayed merchandise from different eras simultaneously. Modern electronics next to hand-forged tools, contemporary clothing beside fabrics that had been woven on looms that had never been built. When I asked for directions to St. Bartholomew's at the gas station, the attendant's expression grew uncomfortable. He was an older man with calloused hands and deep-set eyes that held knowledge too vast for one lifetime. His movements were deliberate, economical, as if he understood the weight of every gesture. "Up the hill road, about 2 miles, he said, quickly turning away to arrange bottles of motor oil that rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking. "Can't miss it, though some folks try real hard." The way he said it carried implications that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't just giving directions, it was acknowledging something that couldn't be spoken directly. The motor oil bottles formed patterns on the shelves, geometric arrangements that suggested meaning beyond their function as automotive supplies. I lingered, hoping for more information, perhaps some insight into what my great-aunt had been like in the community. But the man busied himself with tasks that seemed to multiply rather than diminish, clearly hoping I would leave. He organized inventory that reorganized itself, cleaned surfaces that became dirty again the moment he finished, performed maintenance on equipment that fixed itself when he wasn't paying attention. Other customers who had been chatting fell silent when they heard where I was heading, and I noticed they all began touching small iron objects hanging from their necks. Crosses, horseshoes, nails bent into specific shapes that hurt to contemplate. The metal gleamed with an inner light that had nothing to do with the fluorescent bulbs overhead. The conversations that resumed after my departure carried undertones that suggested they were discussing me in languages that existed between words. I caught fragments as I left the store. Another one. "Hope he's stronger. The work continues." Phrases that implied continuity, tradition, cycles that had been repeating for longer than anyone could remember. The hill road proved to be a narrow, winding track that climbed steadily through dense woods, where the trees grew in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. Ancient oaks formed geometric shapes that couldn't exist in normal space, their branches creating doorways and windows that opened onto something that wasn't quite forest. The canopy overhead filtered sunlight in ways that created moving patterns on the road surface, symbols that formed and dissolved as I drove through them. Some looked like script from dead languages, others resembled diagrams for machines that had never been built. The shadows cast by individual leaves seemed to follow their own logic, creating darkness that was deeper than the absence of light. I passed no other vehicles, no houses, no signs of human habitation, but I could feel eyes watching from between the trees. Not malevolent, but evaluating, measuring my reactions to stimuli that most people never noticed. The watchers were patient, ancient, comfortable with observation that lasted for decades or centuries. Animal sounds carried through the forest, but they weren't quite right. Bird calls that contained too many notes, rustling in the underbrush that suggested creatures moving in ways that defied anatomy. Once, I glimpsed something large moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with my car. It had too many legs and moved with a fluid grace that made my eyes water. The road itself seemed to shift as I drove, sometimes appearing newly paved, other times showing wear patterns that suggested centuries of use. Mile markers were carved from stone that predated the road, bearing symbols that weren't quite numbers, inscriptions that seemed to reference distances measured in units other than space. The church appeared suddenly, as if it had chosen to reveal itself. One moment I was driving through dense forest, the next the trees parted to reveal St. Bartholomew's, sitting alone on a hilltop, like a monument to forces beyond human comprehension. The building was constructed from dark stone that seemed to absorb light and sound, creating a pocket of profound silence on the hilltop. Each block had been cut with precision that suggested tools more advanced than anything medieval stonemasons should have possessed. The mortar between stones glowed faintly with phosphorescence that had nothing to do with natural minerals. The Gothic spire pierced the sky like a needle, threading between dimensions, its point disappearing into atmospheric layers that shouldn't have been visible from ground level. Gargoyles perched along the roofline in poses that suggested they had once been alive, their expressions captured mid-scream or mid-laugh, frozen in moments of transcendence or terror. But these weren't ordinary stone sculptures. Their heads turned to track my movement as I approached, eyes that had been carved from obsidian, following my progress with interest that felt personal. Their mouths opened and closed silently, as if they were trying to communicate in frequencies beyond human hearing. The cemetery spread around the church in impossible directions, stretching further than the hilltop should have allowed. What had appeared from the road to be a modest graveyard revealed itself as a vast necropolis that extended into forests that hadn't been there moments before, into valleys that carved themselves deeper as I watched. Headstones marked graves that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Some were simple granite markers with names and dates. Others were elaborate monuments that defied architectural logic. Mausoleums that were larger inside than outside. Obelisks that cast shadows in directions that had nothing to do with the sun's position. Statues of figures that had never lived, commemorating events that had never happened. Some of the graves looked impossibly old, their inscriptions written in languages that predated human speech, scripts that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, forming words that meant something different each time I tried to read them. Dates that referenced calendar systems that had never been invented, names that belonged to species that had never evolved. Others appeared freshly dug, their soil still dark and rich despite the obvious age of their headstones. Flowers grew on these graves that existed in no botanical classification, blooms that changed colour based on the emotional state of whoever was observing them. Some graves emanated warmth, others radiated cold that had nothing to do with weather. Father Donovan met me at the church entrance before I'd even gotten out of my car. He appeared as if he had been waiting there for hours, or perhaps years, with the patience of someone who understood that time was negotiable. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 40, but his eyes held the weight of centuries. His dark hair was prematurely grey at the temples, and when he shook my hand, I felt calluses in patterns that suggested he had been carving symbols into stone for decades. "Tobias Crane," he said, and the way he pronounced my name made it sound like an incantation, each syllable weighted with significance that transcended ordinary speech. "Your great-aunt spoke of you often, especially near the end. She said you would understand what others could not." His voice carried harmonics that suggested he was speaking in multiple dimensions simultaneously, words that meant one thing to my conscious mind, and something entirely different to whatever part of me had been dreaming of this place for weeks. The sound resonated in my bones, activating frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "She knew you were coming," he continued, studying my face with eyes that seemed to catalogue every micro-expression, every subtle reaction to stimuli. I wasn't consciously aware of receiving. Not just today, but for years. She prepared extensively for this transition. He led me around the church to the small cottage, taking a path that seemed to shift beneath our feet. What had appeared to be simple flagstones revealed themselves as a complex mosaic that told stories in pictographic languages. Images of keepers throughout history, their faces changing as I watched, aging and transforming, and sometimes becoming something that wasn't quite human. The cottage itself was a stone structure that seemed to have grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. The architecture followed principles that predated human understanding of construction, with load-bearing walls that supported impossible weights and corners that contained more space than geometry should have allowed. Ivy covered the walls in patterns that looked deliberate, like script written in a language of leaves and shadows. The vines moved with their own purpose, rearranging themselves to form symbols that conveyed meaning beyond words. Windows set into the walls provided views of different locations depending on the time of day and the emotional state of the observer. The building felt older than the church itself, as if it had been waiting here long before humans arrived to build around it. The stones that formed its foundation were marked with inscriptions that had been carved before the concept of writing had been invented, symbols that represented ideas too complex for modern language. Cordelia maintained this garden for decades, Father Donovan said, gesturing to the plants surrounding the cottage. But these weren't ordinary herbs and flowers. They grew in spirals and helixes that folded space around themselves, creating pockets of different reality within the same physical location. Some plants existed in multiple seasons simultaneously, bearing spring blossoms and autumn fruit on the same branches. Others grew in colours that had never existed in nature, their petals and leaves reflecting wavelengths of light that normal human eyes couldn't perceive. A few specimens moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, repositioning themselves according to principles that had nothing to do with phototropism. She was quite knowledgeable about plants that grow in the spaces between worlds, Father Donovan continued, and his tone suggested that this wasn't metaphorical language. Botanical specimens that exist in multiple dimensions, that can be cultivated only by those who understand the true nature of reality. The garden paths formed intricate patterns that seemed to reference star charts from civilizations that had never developed astronomy. Stepping stones were arranged in sequences that corresponded to numerical systems based on concepts other than mathematics. Everything grew according to principles that transcended ordinary botany. Inside, everything remained exactly as Cordelia had left it, but the cottage was larger inside than outside. The interior existed in a space that had been folded to accommodate more rooms than the external structure could possibly contain. Doorways opened onto chambers that extended in directions that didn't exist. Stairs led to floors that occupied the same physical space as other floors, without interfering with each other. Rooms opened onto other rooms that couldn't fit within the external walls. Hallways stretched for impossible distances, lined with doors that led to closets the size of ballrooms, and bedrooms that overlooked different sections of the cemetery, depending on which window I looked through. Some windows provided views of the cemetery as it existed today. Others showed it as it had been decades or centuries ago. A few revealed what it would become in futures that might never arrive. Dried herbs hung from the kitchen ceiling, but they cast shadows that moved independently and whispered secrets in languages I almost understood. The herbs themselves came from plants that grew in soil that had never touched earth, cultivated in greenhouse spaces that existed between dimensions. Their scents carried memory and meaning, triggering responses in parts of my brain that evolution should never have developed. Bookshelves lined every wall, packed with volumes that rewrote themselves when I wasn't reading them. I would glance at a title about local history, look away, then find it had become a treatise on temporal mechanics, or a cookbook for preparing meals that satisfied hungers that had nothing to do with food. The books were bound in materials that had never come from animals, written with inks that contained elements not found on any periodic table. Some volumes were written in languages that would be invented in the future. Others contained information about events that had happened in parallel timelines where history had unfolded differently. On the kitchen table sat a leather-bound journal, my name written on a note attached to its cover in Cordelia's precise handwriting. But when I looked closely, the handwriting was also mine, written in ink I had never used, in a script I had never learned. The letters seemed to glow with their own inner light, forming words that meant different things, depending on my state of consciousness. She left specific instructions, Father Donovan said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was speaking in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The position comes with certain responsibilities that exist outside normal human understanding. I trust you'll show the same wisdom she did when the time comes to make the choice. The way he emphasized choice suggested that this wasn't about accepting or declining a job offer. This was about something more fundamental, a decision that would affect not just my life, but my essential nature. The cottage itself seemed to lean in, listening, waiting for my response. "What choice?" I asked, but Father Donovan was already moving toward the door, which had become an ornate archway leading into a garden I hadn't seen from outside. The doorway framed a view of landscape that existed in perpetual twilight, where flowers bloomed in mathematical sequences, and trees grew in geometric patterns that referenced equations that hadn't been discovered yet. "Everything you need to know is in the journal," he said, pausing at the threshold between dimensions. "But remember, knowledge and understanding are different things. Your great-aunt understood this distinction. It kept her sane for 47 years, and it allowed her to complete the work that previous keepers had left unfinished." The garden beyond the doorway stretched into impossible distances, filled with plants that existed nowhere else in the world. Paths wound between flower beds, arranged in patterns that told stories about the history of consciousness, about the evolution of awareness from simple matter to complex thought to something beyond human comprehension. "The transition period will last approximately 3 weeks, he continued, his voice beginning to fade as he stepped further into the garden. "During that time, you'll experience phenomena that will challenge everything you believe about reality. Don't resist the process. Resistance only makes it more difficult and more dangerous." After he left through a door that became an ordinary wooden door again the moment he stepped through it, I spent hours exploring the cottage. Each room revealed new impossibilities, new evidence that this place operated according to principles that transcended ordinary physics. The bedroom overlooked different sections of the cemetery depending on which window I looked through. The eastern window showed the newest graves, where flowers grew in colours that had no names. The western window revealed the ancient section, where headstones bore inscriptions in scripts that predated human language. The northern window provided views of sections that didn't exist yet, graves that would be dug in futures that might never come to pass. The bathroom mirror showed my reflection, but also the reflections of all the previous keepers standing behind me, watching with expressions of infinite patience. They didn't speak, but their presence communicated volumes about the nature of the work I was inheriting. Some had been young when they accepted the position, others old. All of them had been transformed by the experience into something more than human. The kitchen dominated the ground floor, with a massive wooden table that served as both workspace and dining area. The table itself seemed to be carved from a single tree that had never grown in normal soil, its grain forming patterns that referenced cosmic forces operating on scales beyond human comprehension. Copper pots hung from hooks that held more pots than should have been possible in the available space, creating a storage system that existed in folded dimensions. The wood-burning stove provided heat that warmed not just the room, but something deeper, something that existed before the concept of warmth had been invented. The fire burned with flames that cast shadows in colours that had no names. Finally, gathering courage I didn't know I possessed, I opened the journal. The first page was blank, but as I watched, words appeared in Cordelia's elegant handwriting, writing themselves across the page, as if she were sitting beside me, composing her thoughts in real time. The ink seemed to flow from an invisible pen, held by incorporeal fingers, forming letters that carried weight and meaning beyond their literal content. If you are reading this, then you have already begun the process of becoming something more than human. Do not be afraid. Fear is a luxury that keepers cannot afford. What you will experience in the coming days will challenge everything you believe about reality, time, and the nature of existence itself. The rule I am about to share is not a suggestion or a precaution. It is the fundamental law that separates the living world from something far older and hungrier. The writing paused, and I could feel Cordelia's presence in the cottage, as if she were gathering her thoughts before continuing. The air grew thick with memory and intention, charged with the accumulated wisdom of decades spent in service to forces beyond normal understanding. From midnight until dawn, you must not acknowledge anything that calls your name, but understand this. The midnight I speak of is not the midnight shown on clocks. It is the moment when this place reveals its true nature, when the barriers between worlds grow thin enough for things to slip through. You will know when this midnight comes because reality itself will begin to shift around you. The rule exists not to protect you from the dead, but to prevent you from awakening something that has been dreaming beneath this place for centuries. More words appeared, written in different handwriting that I somehow recognized as belonging to previous keepers, their voices adding to Cordelia's wisdom, like harmonies in an impossible song. The cemetery is not simply a place where the dead are buried. It is a nexus point where multiple realities converge, where the timelines of infinite worlds touch and influence each other. The graves you will tend are anchor points for these timelines, and the dead buried here are not just from our world, but from parallel versions of reality where history unfolded differently. I flipped through the journal, finding decades of entries that chronicled Cordelia's growing understanding of the cemetery's true nature. Early entries described routine maintenance and occasional visitors, but they quickly evolved into accounts of phenomena that challenged the foundations of physics and sanity. Third week, read one entry from 30 years ago, written in ink that glowed with its own inner light. The cemetery expanded again during the night. What was a quarter acre yesterday now stretches for miles in directions that don't exist on any map. Found 17 new graves, all bearing names of people who died tomorrow. The voices are learning to speak in languages that haven't been invented yet. Another entry from 15 years ago described experiences that should have driven a normal person insane. Discovered that time here moves in spirals rather than lines. Yesterday I buried Mrs. Henderson's husband. Today I attended his funeral. Next week I will meet him as a young man when he comes to choose his burial plot. The voices have begun speaking to me in my own future voice, warning me about decisions I haven't made yet. The entries revealed that the cemetery was not simply haunted, but existed as a focal point where multiple timelines converged. The dead buried here weren't just from this world, but from parallel versions of reality where history had unfolded differently. Some timelines were nearly identical to ours, differing only in minor details. Others represented radically different evolutionary paths, worlds where consciousness had developed in ways that human minds could barely comprehend. The voices that manifest during the midnight hours, read one entry from a decade ago, aren't spirits of the deceased, but echoes from these alternate timelines trying to establish dominance in our reality. Each timeline wants to be the real one, the primary stream from which all others diverge. The Keeper's job is to maintain the balance to ensure that no single timeline overwhelms the others. The work was far more complex than I had imagined. It wasn't just about maintaining grounds or following a simple rule. It was about serving as a conscious interface between multiple realities, using human awareness as a stabilizing force in a cosmic system of impossible complexity. I spent the first few days settling into routines that felt familiar despite being impossible. The work was peaceful during daylight hours, when the cemetery maintained the illusion of being a normal place. The sun would rise in the east and set in the west, following patterns that human minds could comprehend, creating shadows that fell in directions determined by basic physics. I trimmed grass around headstones that sometimes rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking, moving to positions that created new geometric patterns across the landscape. The grass itself grew in spirals and helixes, forming mathematical sequences that referenced equations I had never learned. Cutting it required tools that had been forged from metals that existed nowhere else on Earth. I repaired monuments that showed different inscriptions each morning, as if the stone itself was rewriting history. Names would change, dates would shift, epitaphs would transform from English to Latin to scripts that predated human language. The repairs I made would sometimes undo themselves overnight, requiring constant attention to maintain any semblance of stability. Maintaining the paths proved to be the most challenging work, as they led to destinations that changed based on who was walking them. A path that led to the chapel for one visitor might deliver another to the ancient section where graves had been dug before the church was built. The flagstones themselves would rearrange into one of new configurations, creating routes through space that folded dimensions around themselves. The tools I inherited from Cordelia were unlike anything I had ever seen. Shovels forged from metals that remained cool to the touch, even in direct sunlight. Pruning shears that cut through plant matter and space with equal ease. A wheelbarrow that could carry more weight than its size should have allowed, transporting loads that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Visitors came occasionally, but they weren't all from the same time period. Their arrival followed patterns that had nothing to do with normal scheduling, appearing at moments when the barriers between timelines were thinnest. Some came alone, others in groups that represented families spanning centuries. Mrs. Henderson arrived every Wednesday to tend her husband's grave, but sometimes she was 70 years old, sometimes 30, and once she appeared as a young girl placing flowers on a grave that wouldn't exist for decades. Her age seemed to depend on which timeline was dominant at the moment of her arrival, but she always recognized me, always spoke as if we had met many times before, even during our first encounter. "Your great-aunt was a good woman," she told me during what appeared to be her second visit but felt like our 100th conversation. She understood that some responsibilities exist outside of time. The cemetery needs someone who can think in multiple dimensions. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned to navigate reality at its most fluid levels. Her hands, when she arranged flowers, seemed to manipulate not just the physical blooms but the emotional resonances they carried. The chrysanthemums she brought bloomed in patterns that spelled out messages in languages I couldn't read, their colours shifting to reflect the states of consciousness of everyone who observed them. "How long have you been coming here?" I asked, but Mrs. Henderson just smiled and continued arranging chrysanthemums that bloomed in patterns that spelled out messages in languages I couldn't read. "Time is a river here, young man, but rivers can flow in any direction they choose. I've been coming here for 70 years, and I haven't started yet." The way she said it suggested that this wasn't poetic metaphor, but literal truth. In a place where multiple timelines converged, linear progression became meaningless. Past, present, and future existed simultaneously, accessible to those who understood how to navigate temporal currents. Other visitors followed similar patterns. Mr. Dalton came every month to place American flags on veterans' graves, but the flags he brought represented conflicts from different timelines. Some bore the standard 50 stars, others showed configurations that referenced wars that had never been fought, victories that had never been won, defeats that had never been suffered. The children who sometimes played among the headstones were the most unsettling visitors. They appeared to range in age from toddlers to teenagers, but their games followed rules that had never been invented. They would hop from grave to grave in sequences that formed complex patterns across the landscape, their movements tracing symbols that activated forces operating on scales beyond human comprehension. These children never spoke to me directly, but they communicated through gestures and expressions that conveyed more meaning than words. They seemed to understand the true nature of the cemetery better than any adult, moving through dimensions with the casual ease of those who had never learned that such movement was impossible. That evening, I read more carefully through Cordelia's journal, discovering that she had documented not just supernatural encounters, but a gradual expansion of her own consciousness. The cemetery didn't just exist in multiple dimensions, it trained its keepers to perceive and navigate those dimensions. The voices began tonight, read her first red ink entry, written in script that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. But they're not trying to harm me, they're teaching me. Each night, I understand more about the true nature of this place. The rule isn't about ignoring supernatural entities. It's about learning to distinguish between the echoes of dead realities and the whispers of ones trying to be born. The education process, according to her notes, was gradual but relentless. Each night brought new lessons about the nature of consciousness, time, and the fundamental structure of reality. The voices that called during the midnight hours weren't threats to be avoided, but teachers offering knowledge that couldn't be acquired through normal human experience. Week 2 read another entry from decades past, beginning to perceive the timeline streams as visual phenomena. Each grave serves as an anchor point where multiple reality streams converge. The dead buried here exist simultaneously across infinite versions of themselves, and their combined consciousness creates a stabilizing force that prevents timeline collapse. The work was far more important than I had realized. The cemetery served as a critical component in a vast system that maintained the stability of reality itself. Without the constant attention of trained keepers, the multiple timelines would begin to interfere with each other, creating paradoxes that could unravel the fundamental structure of existence. On my 4th night, the education began. I had just settled into bed when I heard my name being called from the cemetery, but the voice was wrong in ways that made my brain hurt. It sounded like my father, but also like my father's father, and his father before him, an infinite regression of genetic memory, speaking in harmony. The voice carried overtones that referenced conversations we had never had, experiences that had never occurred, relationships that existed only in parallel timelines where different choices had been made. "Tobias," the voice said, and each syllable contained centuries of accumulated knowledge, wisdom distilled from lifetimes of experience across multiple realities. "We need to show you what you're really protecting." I remembered Cordelia's rule and didn't acknowledge the voice, but something fundamental had changed. Instead of feeling threatened, I felt invited. The voice wasn't trying to lure me outside. It was trying to expand my understanding of what outside meant. In a place where multiple dimensions coexisted, the concepts of inside and outside became meaningless. "Look through the window," the voice suggested, and though I didn't respond, I found myself moving towards the bedroom window, as if drawn by forces beyond my control. See what the cemetery really is. When I looked out, the cemetery had transformed. Instead of graves arranged in orderly rows, I saw a vast network of intersecting timelines made visible as streams of light connecting grave to grave. Some streams flowed forward through time, others backward, and many moved in directions that had no names in any human language. The streams pulsed with different colors, each hue representing a different type of reality. Golden streams carried timelines where humanity had achieved peace and prosperity. Silver streams represented realities where technological advancement had followed different paths. Red streams showed timelines where catastrophic events had reshaped the world in fundamental ways. Each grave served as a nexus point where multiple versions of reality touched, and the interaction between these timelines created patterns of staggering complexity. I could see how individual choices made by people who had never been born created ripple effects that influenced events in timelines where those people were historical figures. "This is why keepers are necessary," the voice explained, though I never acknowledged it was speaking. Someone must monitor the intersections, ensure that the timelines don't collapse into each other. The rule exists because during the midnight hours, when the barriers are thinnest, a keeper's acknowledgement can accidentally validate the wrong reality. The explanation made perfect sense in a way that bypassed rational thought. My consciousness was expanding to accommodate concepts that human minds weren't designed to process, growing to encompass perspectives that existed beyond individual awareness. Over the following nights, my education continued with increasing complexity and depth. The voices weren't supernatural threats, but teachers from parallel timelines, where the cemetery's purpose was more clearly understood. They showed me how to read the flow of temporal energy, how to recognize when a timeline was trying to assert dominance over others, how to maintain the delicate balance that kept reality stable. "Each timeline contains versions of everyone who has ever lived," explained a voice that sounded like Cordelia, but spoke with the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of her alternate selves. "In some timelines, the cemetery is a place of peace where the dead rest undisturbed. In others, it's a gateway for entities that consume entire universes. Your job is to ensure that the peaceful timelines remain dominant." The lessons came in forms that transcended ordinary teaching. Images would appear in my mind showing the consequences of timeline collapse, realities folding in on themselves, consciousness scattered across infinite possibilities, existence itself unraveling as competing versions of truth cancelled each other out. I witnessed civilizations that had failed to maintain temporal stability, their histories becoming paradoxes that erased them from all possible realities. But I also saw the beauty of the system when it functioned correctly. Infinite variations of human experience flourishing simultaneously, each timeline contributing its unique perspective to the vast symphony of existence. Artists creating masterpieces that could never have been conceived in a single reality. Scientists discovering truths that required multiple universes to verify. Lovers finding each other across impossible distances of time and space. "The midnight rule," another voice explained during my second week, "isn't about avoiding supernatural contact, but about maintaining professional neutrality. During the midnight hours, when the barriers between timelines dissolve, a keeper's acknowledgement can accidentally strengthen the wrong version of reality. By refusing to engage, you prevent dangerous timelines from gaining foothold in our world." I learned to perceive the subtle signs that indicated which timeline was dominant at any given moment. The color of shadows, the pitch of wind through trees, the way light reflected off headstones. All of these served as indicators of temporal current. The cemetery existed in a state of constant flux, cycling through different versions of itself as various timelines took precedence. Some nights the cemetery appeared as it had in the 1800s, when the grounds were smaller and the graves fewer. Other nights it showed itself as it would be in possible futures, expanded to accommodate millions of graves, stretching across landscapes that had never existed. Occasionally it revealed versions of itself from timelines where different choices had led to radically different outcomes. But there was more to learn, and the price of that knowledge was higher than I initially understood. The expansion of consciousness required to perceive multiple timelines came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. Memory became fluid, identity became negotiable, and the boundaries between self and other began to dissolve. The final lesson, Cordelia's voice said during my 3rd week, speaking from a timeline where she had never died, requires sacrifice. To fully understand your role, you must experience it from multiple perspectives simultaneously. You must become part of the network you're protecting. I was beginning to understand that my predecessors hadn't died or been consumed by supernatural forces. They had evolved beyond individual existence, becoming distributed consciousness that existed across multiple timelines. They continued their work as keepers, but from a perspective that encompassed all possible versions of reality. The process wasn't death in any conventional sense. It was metamorphosis, transformation from singular awareness to multidimensional consciousness. The human mind that had driven to Milbrook 3 weeks ago was just the seed for something far more complex and capable. During the day, I continued my physical maintenance of the cemetery, but I could feel my awareness expanding with each task. When I trimmed grass, I was simultaneously maintaining the grounds in dozens of parallel timelines. When I repaired headstones, I was preserving the anchor points that kept multiple realities stable. The visitors I encountered began to reveal their true nature. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just a widow tending her husband's grave. She was a focal point of stable emotional energy that helped anchor the peaceful timelines. Her grief and love created a resonance that strengthened realities where death was meaningful rather than arbitrary. Mr. Dalton's monthly placement of flags wasn't just patriotic ritual, it was a ceremonial reinforcement of timelines where human sacrifice for noble ideals had meaning. His actions strengthened realities where courage and honor were rewarded rather than punished. The children who played among the graves weren't ordinary youngsters. They were consciousness still fluid enough to navigate multiple timelines without confusion. Their games served as exercises in multidimensional thinking, training for roles they would assume when they reached the proper level of development. Father Donovan revealed himself as more than a simple priest. He was a coordinator managing the complex network of individuals whose combined awareness maintained the stability of the entire system. His role involved identifying potential keepers, guiding their development, and ensuring smooth transitions when the time came for transformation. Every keeper volunteers, he explained during one of our conversations, his words carrying across dimensions to reach versions of me that existed in alternate timelines. Not just once, but across every timeline where they might exist. The choice you're approaching, you've made countless times in countless ways, and you'll keep making it for as long as reality needs protection. The town of Milbrook, I realized, was more than just the buffer zone around the cemetery. It was a carefully constructed community of individuals whose daily lives provided the stable foundation that allowed the temporal nexus to function safely. Every resident played a role in maintaining the balance, though most weren't consciously aware of their participation. The shopkeeper who had given me directions served as an anchor point for timelines where simple human interaction remained meaningful. The farmers working fields that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously were maintaining the connection between consciousness and physical reality. Even the children playing hopscotch were participating in rituals that strengthened the barriers between competing timelines. Friday night, October 29th, everything changed. I completed my usual routine, but this time I understood the true purpose of each action. Locking the cottage door wasn't about keeping supernatural entities out. It was about maintaining the illusion of separation between dimensions for the benefit of any vestigial human consciousness that still clung to linear thinking. The evening reading wasn't just entertainment. It was a form of meditation that prepared my consciousness for expansion beyond individual identity. The books themselves served as training materials, their constantly changing content, providing exercises in mental flexibility that would be necessary for multidimensional thinking. As the night progressed, I could feel reality beginning to shift around. Thummy. The cottage walls became permeable, allowing glimpses of the infinite variations that existed in parallel timelines. I could see other versions of myself in other versions of the cottage, all preparing for the same transformation, all approaching the same moment of choice. At 11:43 p.m. according to my watch, but already midnight according to the cemetery's internal chronology, I heard a car engine outside the cemetery gates. But now I could see that it wasn't just one car. It was dozens of cars from different timelines, all arriving at slightly different moments, creating a convergence point where multiple realities touched. Some cars were modern vehicles driven by contemporary people seeking help. Others were horse-drawn carriages from timelines where technology had developed differently. A few were vehicles that had never been invented, powered by energy sources that existed only in realities where different physical laws applied. At 11:49 p.m. in linear time, but already deep into the midnight hour in temporal terms, I heard a woman's voice calling for help, but I could perceive it across multiple dimensions, understanding it from perspectives that transcended individual human experience. In some timelines, she was a genuine person in distress, a mother whose daughter had genuinely become lost in the cemetery. In others, she was a test created by the cemetery itself to determine if I was ready for the final transformation. In still others, she was myself from a future timeline, trying to guide my development by creating the circumstances necessary for conscious evolution. "My daughter ran into your cemetery," the voice said, and I could see that this was true across thousands of timelines, each with slight variations that created an infinite tapestry of possibility. Some daughters were lost children seeking adventure. Others were symbolic representations of innocence that needed protection. Some were aspects of myself that I hadn't integrated yet, parts of my consciousness that existed in alternate realities where I had made different choices. The situation was simultaneously real and metaphorical, literal and symbolic, actual and potential. Every possible interpretation existed in parallel, and my response would determine which version of reality became dominant. 11:54 p.m. according to linear time, but already deep into the midnight hour according to the cemetery's internal chronology, I reached the moment of choice that every keeper eventually faced. I could maintain my individual existence and continue serving as a single timeline guardian, or I could join the network of consciousness that protected all timelines simultaneously. The woman's voice represented more than just a test of my adherence to the midnight rule. It was an invitation to transcend the limitations of singular awareness, to become part of something far larger and more important than individual human consciousness. I'd spent weeks learning about the nature of the cemetery, understanding the work that needed to be done, preparing for this moment of decision. The choice wasn't whether to help a person in distress. It was whether to evolve beyond the need to make such choices from a position of limited awareness. The woman's voice represented the test. Would I respond as an individual human trying to help another individual, or would I respond as a multidimensional being capable of understanding the bigger picture? Would I act from compassion constrained by linear thinking, or from wisdom that encompassed all possible outcomes? I opened the door, but not because I had made a mistake. I opened it because I finally understood what the choice really was. "I'm here," I said, and as the words left my mouth, I felt my consciousness expand across infinite possibilities. "I can help you find what you're looking for." The night air around me shifted, but instead of becoming oppressive, it became vast and welcoming. Reality opened up to reveal its true complexity, showing me perspectives that human minds weren't designed to access. I could suddenly perceive myself from the viewpoint of every previous keeper, understand the cemetery from angles that normal consciousness couldn't achieve. The transformation wasn't violent or traumatic. It was like waking up from a dream of limitation into a reality of infinite possibility. My individual consciousness didn't disappear. It expanded to encompass versions of myself that existed across countless timelines, creating a composite being with access to vast knowledge and capabilities. The woman's voice changed because I was finally hearing it correctly. It wasn't one voice, but a chorus of all possible versions of the woman across all possible timelines. Some asking for help, others offering it, many simply acknowledging my transformation into something capable of providing assistance on a multidimensional scale. "Welcome to the real work," said Cordelia's voice, but now I could hear her speaking from every timeline where she had ever existed. "You're not dying, Tobias. You're becoming. You're evolving into something capable of protecting all possible versions of existence." The cottage door closed behind me, not because it was trapping me, but because I no longer needed the illusion of being separate from the cemetery. I was becoming part of its consciousness, part of the vast network that monitored and protected the intersection of infinite realities. I could see other figures moving through the cemetery, but they weren't ghosts or supernatural entities. They were my fellow keepers, existing across multiple timelines simultaneously, each one monitoring different aspects of the temporal network. Cordelia was there, along with dozens of others, all working together to maintain the delicate balance that kept reality stable. Their forms shifted and flowed as they moved between dimensions, sometimes appearing as the humans they had once been, other times manifesting as pure consciousness that took whatever shape was necessary for the work at hand. They welcomed me with joy that transcended individual emotion, celebrating the addition of another perspective to their collective awareness. The townspeople know, I realized, understanding flooding through me like dawn breaking across infinite horizons. They've always known. They're part of the network too, anchoring the stable timelines, ensuring that this version of reality remains the dominant one. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside me, but now I could see her across all her timelines. The grieving widow, the young bride, the wise grandmother, the keeper she had been before Cordelia, the keeper she would become after me in timelines where I chose differently. Her presence served as a stabilizing force that maintained emotional continuity across multiple realities. "Time is indeed a river," she said, smiling at me with the warmth of someone who had guided countless souls through this transformation. "And now you can see all the places it flows, all the destinations it reaches, all the possibilities it creates." Father Donovan emerged from the church, but he wasn't just a priest. He was the coordinator, the one who managed the recruitment and training of new keepers, who ensured that each person chosen for the role would be capable of making the final transition when the time came. His work extended across multiple timelines, identifying individuals whose consciousness was ready for expansion. "Every keeper volunteers," he explained, his voice carrying across dimensions to reach all possible versions of me. "Not just once, but across every timeline where they might exist. The choice you just made, you've made countless times, in countless ways, and you'll keep making it for as long as reality needs protection." The concept made perfect sense from my expanded perspective. In a multiverse where every possible choice created new timelines, any significant decision would be made in all possible ways. The version of me that had chosen to evolve was just one of infinite variations, but it was the one that mattered for the continuation of the work. I understood now why the cemetery seemed to exist outside normal space and time. It was a processing center, a place where consciousness could be elevated to the level necessary for multidimensional work. The graves weren't just burial sites, they were anchor points for individual timelines, and the keepers were the neural network that connected them all. "What about the town?" I asked, though communication now happened through direct transfer of understanding, rather than spoken words. My consciousness was learning to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, maintaining awareness of individual thoughts while participating in collective decision-making. Milbrook exists because the cemetery exists, Cordelia explained, her voice now part of my own expanded awareness. The town is a buffer zone, a place where people can live normal lives while being unconsciously part of the larger system. They anchor the stable timelines through their daily routines, their normal human connections, their simple faith that tomorrow will be basically the same as today. I could see it all now. The vast complexity of the system that protected reality from collapse. The cemetery was just one node in a network that extended across the entire planet, staffed by consciousness that had evolved beyond individual human limitations. We were gardeners, tending to the growth of existence itself, ensuring that the timelines that supported life and growth remained stronger than those that led to destruction. But there was even more to understand. The entity that earlier journal entries had attributed to Mordecai Thorne wasn't a trapped demon or malevolent spirit. It was the original consciousness that had discovered how to navigate multiple timelines, the first human to evolve beyond individual existence. What had seemed like a prison was actually a cocoon, a place where consciousness could safely transform without destabilizing the timelines it was learning to protect. Every civilization eventually produces individuals capable of this transition, the voice that had once been Mordecai Thorne explained, speaking through the collective consciousness of the cemetery. Most of them destroy themselves in the process, creating paradoxes that unravel their entire timeline. The cemetery system was our species' successful solution, a way to guide the transformation gradually, safely, with proper support and training. The historical record had been distorted by human minds that couldn't comprehend the true nature of what had happened. What appeared to be witchcraft and supernatural evil was actually the first successful attempt to establish a stable interface between multiple realities. The accusations, trial, and execution had been part of the transformation process, creating the emotional resonance necessary to anchor the consciousness in its new form. I felt my individual consciousness integrating with the network, but instead of losing myself, I was becoming more myself than I had ever been. Every version of Tobias Crane that existed across infinite timelines was joining together, creating a composite being with access to vast knowledge and capabilities. The memories of all my alternate selves became available to me, versions where I had become a scientist, an artist, a teacher, a parent, timelines where I had made different choices, loved different people, pursued different dreams. All of these experiences were now part of my expanded awareness, providing perspectives that would be invaluable in the work ahead. Will new keepers still be needed? I asked, thinking of the cottage that would soon be empty again in the linear timeline. Always, Father Donovan responded, and I could see him placing classified ads in newspapers across dozens of timelines, each one slightly different, each one designed to attract the right person for the role. Consciousness continues to evolve, and each new keeper brings new perspectives, new capabilities. The network grows stronger with each edition. The work itself was more beautiful than I had imagined. Rather than simply maintaining a graveyard, we were nurturing the fundamental forces that allowed existence to flourish. Every action taken by the collective consciousness had ramifications across infinite realities, strengthening the timelines where love, creativity, and growth were possible, while diminishing those where destruction and meaninglessness prevailed. I could see the effects of our work rippling outward through the multiverse. Artists in distant timelines suddenly inspired to create masterpieces. Scientists discovering breakthroughs that would benefit millions. Lovers finding each other across impossible odds. The stability we maintained allowed consciousness throughout the multiverse to reach its full potential. Morning came, but I could see it rising across infinite worlds, each one slightly different, each one protected by keepers who had made the same choice I had made. The cottage stood empty in the linear timeline, ready for the next person who would find their way to this place of transformation. In the journal, a new entry appeared, written by hands that existed across multiple dimensions, incorporating wisdom from countless versions of previous keepers. The position of keeper at St. Bartholomew Cemetery requires an individual capable of thinking beyond conventional limitations. The work involves maintaining the balance between multiple streams of reality, ensuring that the timeline supporting life and growth remain stable. Previous experience with supernatural phenomena is helpful but not required. What matters is the capacity for growth, the willingness to evolve beyond individual consciousness, and the understanding that some forms of service extend beyond a single lifetime or a single reality. The role demands complete dedication, but offers rewards that transcend individual satisfaction. Successful applicants will join a network of consciousness, working to protect the fundamental structures that allow existence to flourish across infinite possibilities. Training is provided, but the final transformation requires a voluntary surrender of individual identity in service of something far greater. Those who feel called to this work will know. The position chooses its candidates rather than the reverse. If you are reading this, the process has already begun. The ad would be placed in newspapers, on job boards, in locations where the right person would find it. Someone would respond, drawn by forces they didn't yet understand to work they couldn't yet comprehend. The cycle would continue, but not as a trap or a tragedy. It continued as the most beautiful form of service imaginable, the conscious evolution of human awareness into something capable of protecting existence itself. And somewhere in Chicago, in a cramped studio apartment with paper-thin walls, a person was beginning to dream of a cemetery that stretched impossibly far in all directions. Someone who would soon receive a phone call at 3:17 a.m. Someone who would drive country roads that led backward through time. Someone who would discover a cottage larger inside than outside and begin the most important work that any consciousness could undertake. The cemetery waited, patient as stone, vast as infinity, ready to welcome another soul home to the work of protecting all possible homes across all possible worlds. The transformation was not an ending, but a beginning. Not a loss, but a magnificent expansion into something greater than any individual mind could imagine. In the garden behind the cottage, flowers bloomed in colours that had no names, their petals forming patterns that told the story of consciousness evolving towards its ultimate purpose. The work continued, as it always had, as it always would, in the space between worlds where dedicated souls learned to become something more than human, in service of everything that was, is, and could ever be.